This is, as I said earlier, the UK's National Awareness Week and the biggest green energy conference. And for the last 3 years, we've run this event and delivered it entirely online. Thanks very much indeed also to our sponsors of Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week, the Energy Research Accelerator, ERA. As I said just a minute ago, this session is all about networks, how we're going to put things in place so that we can upgrade for a net zero Britain. My name is Andy Walker. I'm an infrastructure and construction journalist. And what we're going to be looking at in this session is taking on board as demand on the UK's energy system accelerates from the renewables and electric vehicles to data centres and new industrial growth. The grid is going to be under unprecedented pressure. And what we hope to do in this session is to bring together some global and regional leaders to explore how we modernise and expand our power networks to meet that challenge. We have a number of very knowledgeable speakers in this session. We're going to be kicking off with Adrian Del Maestro, who's the Global Head of Energy Advisory at AECOM. He's going to be looking at why power networks are now a critical enabler of the energy transition, and he's going to explore some of the challenges involved in delivering all of that. Following Adrian, we've got Dr. Jennie Stein, who's head of net zero at Enterprise in Cumbria, and she's also a Society for the Environment board member. She's going to look at some of the realities on the ground in her area, which is an area rich in industrial capacity and renewable potential, but also has some geographical and grid constraints. And then finally, we've got James Veaney, who's Deputy Director for Electricity Sector Price Reviews at Ofgem, who's going to discuss the all-important approach that Ofgem are taking to design the next price control for the electricity distribution networks in Great Britain. And I'm hoping, and I'm sure this will be the case, that our three speakers will map out what it really means to unblock the grid, accelerate clean energy projects, and ensure that every region of the country, including those at the edge of the network, can fully participate in Britain's energy transition. Because at the end of the day, that's what we need, and that's what consumers and customers are going to need as well. Anyway, so that's what we're going to be doing in this particular session here. First of all, we've got Adrian Del Maestro, as I said, who's the Global Head of Energy Advisory at AECOM. Adrian advises a portfolio of clients ranging from technology companies, utilities and oil and gas operators to low carbon developers, startups, investors and government. Adrian, it's over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be here with you, Andy, again on the panel and with Jennie and James. I thought it might be helpful just a few introductory comments just to set the scene, and then our co-panelists will build on these. I guess the first thing is the grid. When we talk about the grid, we're talking about power transmission and distribution in the UK is extremely important. And there's going to not be an energy transition without the grid. So you might have heard this very appropriate theme, no transmission, no transition. So it's kind of essential to it. And if you think about the wave of electrification that we're seeing across the country, and this is a trend that we're seeing in developed and developing countries, think about emergence of electric vehicles, heat pumps, green hydrogen, data centers, which we'll come back to. All this demand is going to have to be carried by the grid. And the world has changed. If you think back 50 years ago, the way the power flowed in the country was you had the big coal-fired power stations in the north, centers of demand in the south, and you had these transmission cables that would carry the power from one place to another, kind of one directional. With the emergence of renewables, etc., you're having this bi-directional flow. So it's a much more complex picture. Now, in terms of some of the challenges, and we'll go into a lot of detail in the subsequent conversation, but there are a number of major challenges facing the grid, and this is in no order of priority, but we have connection queues. in terms of companies that are looking to get a connection to the grid. Sometimes they're waiting for quite a long time. You might be putting in a request now and not getting it until the 2030s. Aging infrastructure. The grid that we see now was originally established in the 1950s, 1960s. So there's a lot that needs to be upgraded, replaced, and added. We have supply chain constraints. Chris was talking about some of the challenges in offshore wind. Well, there were and are similar challenges with the supply chain, with the grid in terms of accessing equipment, even labor force in terms of having enough people, and I'll come back to that again later on. So you have a number of these challenges facing the grid. The good news is that we're making progress. We've had policy reform to improve the connection queue congestion, which is good, still work in progress, but it's going in the right direction. We're seeing investment flow into the sector. This is part of a broader trend that we're seeing globally. But in the UK, there's something like £80 billion that's going to be spent over the next few years in upgrading the grid, which is really important. And you're seeing a lot of technology innovation. Again, we'll go into detail, but you're seeing the impact of AI, new solutions to enhance the capabilities of existing overlying cables, etc. So you're seeing an upside on that. All of this, if you look at the big picture, is great news, but it is a massive endeavor. You know, in terms of the work that we're going to have to deliver in the next few years is equivalent to the amount of work that we did in the last 30 years. So it's a big endeavor. I think the other thing is this is a topic that's becoming increasingly politicized. You're hearing a lot about opposition in some areas to the erection of electricity pylons around the country, NIMBYism. But I think the other theme is just the cost of energy, cost of living. That's becoming a theme for consumers, from people like you and I to businesses that are incurring some of the costs of these network upgrades. I think that's becoming a much more political issue. And then you've got variables, I think, such as the impact of data centers, which interestingly, on the one hand, it's a huge growth opportunity for the sector, for AI data centers, for the national economy, for employment, etc., which is great. But the demand on power, which is another conversation, and the implications of the grid are pretty significant. So lots of challenges, lots of progress, but we've got this massive endeavor to kind of get the grid up to a state that we need. And it's going to be the catalyst to enable us to electrify and decarbonize our society. Hopefully that sets the scene.
Many thanks indeed, Adrian, for that. And I think, you know, a couple of things that stand out from what you said there. The sheer scale of all of this and the challenges that it entails. I like that, you know, that comment, no transmission, no transition. But also as well, just underlining, you know, the scale, the fact that we are going to have to pack in, you know, we know things are moving much more quickly these days as well, but that we are looking to pack in the work of the last 30 years almost in terms of scale into the next few years. And that just shows, you know, the scale of the challenge itself. I mean, obviously technology and capability and resource will assist in that, but nevertheless, it just shows what a massive challenge that we actually have. We probably, or maybe we won't have time to go into some of the, you know, the political challenges in this session. I'm sure they'll come up later on in our event, but there are some, I think there's some key messages here as well, dare I say it, for government in terms of how it frames all of this stuff as well to increase public support. But for now, and again, just to say, if people have got questions for any of our panelists in this session, there's an icon on screen which looks like a little a laptop with a question mark in it. Just pop your questions in there and we'll try and get to as many of them as we possibly can. Next up, we've got Dr. Jennie Stein, who, as I said, is head of Net Zero Enterprise in Cumbria, and she's also a Society for the Environment board members. Jennie is a chartered environmentalist and a senior leader driving net zero and clean growth strategies across government, industry and academia. And as head of Net Zero Enterprise in Cumbria, she leads regional programs on energy decarbonisation. So Jennie, it's over to you.
Yeah, fantastic to be here, Andy. Thanks for welcoming me into the session. And it's great to be able to present a regional perspective. I always really like to introduce Cumbria at the start, because I think lots of people think of Cumbria, they think of the landscape and the visitor economy, the strengths in agriculture and land management. But Cumbria has also got real strengths in manufacturing, in advanced manufacturing, quite heavy industry, as well as in nuclear and defence, with significant sites on the west coast of Cumbria at Sellafield, and submarine manufacture in the south. So the picture in Cumbria is also one of strength in energy, and we've got a really strong history in energy generation, renewables and clean energy. We were really an early mover in offshore and onshore wind, and we were the location of the world's first commercial nuclear power station at Calder Hall. So we've got real historical strengths and capabilities, and really ambitious plans for achieving net zero and providing more energy generation, with a target to achieve net zero by 2037. But yes, we have significant constraints, and Adrian has touched on some of those. We're really constrained by geography, so we're a really large county, and lots of those constraints around infrastructure, road and rail, and grid connectivity is a real challenge, both in terms of new industries securing a connection to the grid, but also in terms of the huge potential we've got for additional renewable generation, with potential new offshore wind or hydropower, new nuclear with SMRs connecting into the grid. So we're really having to look at innovative solutions to how we manage those grid constraints and ensure that Cumbria's potential in contributing to clean power 2030 and beyond can be reached. And we can go into the detail of those further, Andy.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Jenny, and I'm sure we will go into those a little bit further when we get to the discussion part of our session here. I've seen there's a few questions that people are posting in our questions box, and we'll get to those after we hear from our next speaker, who is James Veaney, who is Deputy Director, Electricity Sector Price Reviews at Ofgem. James is responsible at Ofgem for setting price controls for the electricity sector, so a very important role indeed. He's previously worked on both electricity and gas price controls, and he led the design of the current electricity distribution price control. He's also worked at Ofwat and was part of the leadership team for price control for water and waste water companies as well. So someone with a wide range of experience in this very important area. So James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy, and good morning, everyone. Yes, so I'm going to focus primarily on the next electricity distribution price control, ED3, which starts in 2028. I'm just coming out of the electricity transmission price control, which will be starting next year. So also happy to take any questions on that if they arise. So in terms of the process, we're currently developing the methodology that we'll apply to that price control, and we'll expect to make a decision on that in around May this year. So you know, we're in the midst of policy development at the moment, but the objectives that we want to achieve through the price control are, well, we've got the typical objectives that we always want to achieve through the price control, which is how do we keep the lights on, how do we make sure that customers can get connected to the network, and how can we make sure that the networks are reliable and meet increasing demands for electricity, all at an affordable price for consumers, because these costs are recovered through the energy bill, and they constitute an increasingly significant percentage of the energy bill. And just for context, the recent electricity transmission price control is likely to add over £100 to, and the network charge element at least is likely to add over £100 to the energy bill over the next 5 years, albeit that investment will help to bring down constraint costs So along with those typical objectives that we would, classically always apply into a distribution price control, we've also identified the opportunity to ensure that the networks are ready for the anticipated electrical growth in electrical demand that we expect to come through the 2030s and onto 2050. So ED3 itself is a 5-year price control, but we're looking beyond those 5 years to think about where demand might grow, and how do we ensure that the opportunity is taken within this window so that the networks do not become blockers to that increased demand. I should add that although there may be constraints in localized parts of the networks, generally speaking, the distribution networks do have capacity headroom. More generally, we're not facing the same sort of macro constraints that we had at transmission, which led to the additional costs that consumers have to bear because of those. So that's the ambition. We want to take this opportunity to ensure the networks are fit for purpose for the demands that will come over the next 20 years. I mean, I guess we've always wanted to do that, but in the past we've been sort of impeded by sort of the absence of robust strategic plans that give us and give the company certainty on what to build, when to build it, how much to build. Each of the price controls we've undertaken over the previous decade and a half have been preceded by forecasts of increasing demand, which hasn't really materialized over that period. Now, as a result of the actions taken by government, and also actions taken by other parties, and also the creation of the NESO, we now think we're in a better position to be able to get more clarity and more certainty on the nature of that future demand. And even if we can't pinpoint exactly when it's going to occur, we think we can take a relatively low risk approach to know that if there is additional expenditure, it may not prove to be something which we come to greatly regret because it's in the wrong place or it's not needed at all. So we're looking for the NESO to develop these strategic plans which will inform the investments that the companies will then undertake. And we're asking the companies to think about the 5 years of ED3 in the context of 25 years and identify where there are opportunities to make strategic investment in new capacity now, where that's the most effective way of ensuring the networks are fit for purpose for the future. So this could involve, for instance, if you're going to have to replace an asset because it's come to the end of its useful asset life, maybe install something larger if that gives you that additional capacity and avoids having to dig up roads more than once or replace assets multiple times over that period. And it also may mean that where you add new capacities to the network to meet demand that's emerging in the near term, you take the opportunity to add additional size into that capacity in readiness for, say, heat pumps or more demand from electric vehicles. But it's not a blank check. We want the companies to really think about where that would be the appropriate step to take, and where the consequence of delaying or not making that investment would lead to the networks becoming bottlenecks or potentially more cost to consumers over time. I think we also want the companies to think about customers on a more granular and bespoke basis. On connections, for instance, I think they've had long established relationships with house builders and large generators who know the process of how you get connected to the network. Most of us probably don't, unlikely to have had much experience of going through that process. But as consumers increasingly start to want to install EV charging points or heat pumps, they are going to have an interface with the companies. And we want the DNOs to increasingly sort of recognize or see the world from the customer's point of view and think about how we can make these technical engineering processes user-friendly and quick. Because if customers who are eager to take up low carbon technologies are facing a 9-month delay for doing so, it's not going to help the energy transition if that's the case. So as well as building the networks, and us setting a price control that enables that investment, we also want a step change in the customer service that the companies can offer so that it is tailored to meet the requirements of new types of customers that they'll be dealing with.
Okay, thanks very much, James, for that. We've got stacks of questions coming in to our question thread, and I'm going to get to those in a second. In fact, I'm going to get to those straight away. I've also got some questions as well up my sleeve that I want to ask, but I'm going to kick one off first of all, and I think I'll address this to Adrian, but if any of our other panelists want to talk about any of this, then basically just dive in after Adrian's finished. There's a question in the thread from Chloe Barrett, and she said, what are some of the key projects or initiatives that have either been successful or are underway to overcome some of the challenges within the grid? Adrian mentioned a lot of work has been done to reduce the queue for grid connections. It would be good to know more on this. Adrian, any comments on that?
Yeah, really good question. So policy reform I mentioned earlier, so the government has introduced the kind of, it used to be first come, first served approach. It's now first ready, first served. So it's looking for projects that are ready to get up and go. There's been an issue, for example, I know, for example, with data centers, they call them shadow data center projects. So ones that not really are ready to go. So there's been a reform of that process. That's good news. I think some of the other solutions, it doesn't get talked a lot about unless you're in industry circles, but there is not enough talent to deliver these projects, in terms of engineering talent, in terms of professional services talent across these transmission companies. And that's been quite a big bottleneck. And what's interesting to note is many of these transmission companies have actually upped their recruitment targets. So from memory, I think National Grid is looking to grow in the short term about 70% of its workforce. Scottish Power is looking to double its workforce over the next few years. Scottish SSE is also looking to grow by about 40%. So you're seeing these companies recruiting more talent. Having said that, extremely laudable that they're looking to recruit more. Whether they actually can bring those people in and retain them is another issue, because I think that whole topic around recruitment, shortfalls in talent in the broader energy market, not just transmission, but utilities, hydrocarbons, all these sectors look up, they're all struggling with finding enough people. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. The other topic I just wanted to flag was, the impact of technology will make a difference. It won't resolve the shortfall of talent that we have, but it will be extremely helpful. So I'm not going to mention specific company names. If anyone's interested, reach out to me offline afterwards. But to give you a flavor, you've got startups that are introducing technologies using robotics that allow them to put coatings on overhead cables that can improve the performance of those cables by about 30%. And that's just by applying a coating, one simple example. There's a lot of expectation around the implementation of AI. So you'll hear stuff around flexible markets. So I think NESO says there's about 16 gigawatts of flexible capacity in the UK. And that's another way of saying that you can manage those energy flows more astutely. So you can use AI software that can match supply and demand depending on the time of the day that can help manage those flows. There are AI companies out there that have got some really interesting solutions. And this may sound very mundane, but it helps a lot in terms of providing a platform for engineering documents to be exchanged and shared very quickly and updated quickly. So that accelerates the process to allow you to deploy the infrastructure. And then you've also got things like demand side response. So this has been quite successful in terms of incentivizing market behavior, consumers to switch on and off according to certain times of the day when there may be a congested grid. Maybe you switch on your washing machine in the middle of the night, for example, when there's not so much demand for power. So that demand side flexible response, those flexible capacity, it's all part of these broader technology solutions that are also helping us move forward. And just one final point, I talked about data centers. Again, one of the big transmission companies has a partnership with an AI company that's looking to see if they can actually manage the flows throughout the day of when data centers need power according to when the grid's congested. So again, nice example of the use of technology there.
Thanks very much. Sorry, go on, Jennie.
Yeah, from a local perspective, Andy, if we've got time, some of the solutions we've been looking at to mitigate the problem of grid constraints is potentially co-locating new energy generation with end users, off-takers. So exploring private wire options for linking up generation with use of that electricity or energy, so that you're not having the same impact on the grid and you're mitigating the constraints. So one example of this at the moment in Cumbria is at Pioneer Park near the Sellafield site, where we're undergoing a master planning process looking at potentially new renewables, including nuclear small modular reactors, and then linking that up with energy generators, energy users locally, so you're not having the same impact on the grid. The other consideration, given that we're a really rural area with dispersed industry, is looking at non-electrification options, such as non-pipeline transport of hydrogen or biomethane or biogases. So there's different solutions and mitigations that could be really helpful when we're just thinking about that strategic planning, and they can have real knock-on benefits in terms of reindustrialization of some of these areas and bringing in new energy-intensive industries.
Thanks, Jennie. I just want to move over to James and deal with a question that's come in from Emma Thorpe in the chat. What are your primary objectives for the grid upgrade program over the next 3 to 10 years, and which parts of the program are most constrained by supply chain capacity or lead times? And I suppose kind of flowing out of that, what are the different objectives that Ofgem are seeking to achieve through its price controls?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I mean, I think I touched upon the objectives in my sort of earlier spiel, but I think it's essentially, I'd say, keep the reliability of the network at a really high level, which it is currently. Make sure people can get connected, and make sure that the networks are ready for a future increase in demand that is likely to arise. As I said, in terms of where the constraints are, generally speaking, the local distribution networks, obviously there are localized pinch points, but generally speaking, there is headroom capacity. What we're particularly concerned about is the sort of bow wave of demand that's likely to come either at the back end of ED3 or into ED4. And if we don't take steps now, then, by the time that demand emerges, we may find that, the networks do become a blocker, and that's what we're primarily seeking to avoid. So, with the NESO developing its capability of with input from people like Jennie and Adrian and the networks themselves, developing these regional energy strategic plans, we think we can get a better feel for where that future demand is likely to emerge, and the networks can use that to inform what their response needs to be. What we've signaled through the price control is that I don't think we were ever like this, but we are open to considering the need for strategic anticipatory investment, even if the demand isn't, even if the network isn't currently constrained. If we can see that there's a case to be made, then we'll be open to supporting investment where that's the case. I think part of the challenge is always going to be, Adrian touched upon this earlier, is that it's going to impact on customer bills. So we're still going to have to do our job of making sure that the customers are getting a good deal out of this process. Now, for the transmission price control that we'd recently concluded, there was a sort of direct benefit we could point to in exchange for the investment in transmission and the increase in network charges that are associated with that. We could point to network constraint costs coming down, and overall there's a net benefit to consumers in the 5-year period of making that investment. For distribution networks, the maths don't quite work out that way, because the customers, the generality of customers aren't currently paying for constraint costs at the distribution network. So we're going to have to be able to articulate the broader benefits that society and customers as a whole will realise through this investment. And as Adrian said, it's likely to become, is already and it's likely to become increasingly a sort of a sensitive political topic. So we'll all have to hold our feet to the fire to when our commitments turn into pounds on customer bills, we'll have to be make sure that we can stand by our words now and follow through on that, because of the longer term benefits that this will realize. But we can't be blind to the fact that we still have to do our job and make sure customers are getting the best possible deal they can out of this, and we're not allowing through investment which is more expensive than it needs to be, or actually too risky to undertake now. That wouldn't be in anyone's interest, either in the near term or the long term, if we're not sufficiently prudent. What I will say, touching upon what we how the price controls can support easing constraints on the network as well as the direct investment. One of the things we identified in the transmission price control were supply chain constraints. Now, we've got around £80 billion worth of investment going into the transmission networks over the next 5 years. Most of that investment, most of the allowances we'll be providing to the companies will be in the period when specific projects come forward for funding. Now, we identified that waiting 2-3 years' time for funding to be made available could mean that when those companies come to purchase their materials, they're facing severe delays, because lots of countries in the Western Hemisphere and beyond are going to the same suppliers for the same equipment. So we introduced in the transmission price control, ahead of making a final decision on the overall price control, we introduced an advanced procurement mechanism that gave the industry access to billions of pounds worth of allowances that to be able to make early orders for material which we felt was fungible, that if that project doesn't go ahead, you can use those, you can use that steel, you can use that cabling on another project. So it was slightly risky step for us to take, but we felt it was the right step for us to take for the consumer, if it ultimately meant we could get these projects delivered as soon as possible.
Thanks, James. I've got a question for Jennie. There's something in the chat from Kevin Kendall. He says, what about local energy? May I suggest that we've reached peak grid? So my question for Jennie is kind of twofold. Adrian mentioned earlier things like AI as well, the use of AI. I wondered how long it'd be before AI was mentioned today. Not long is the answer. So two questions, or a linked question for Jennie. What role does regional and local energy planning play in all of this? And also, we talk about innovation. What innovative solutions to grid constraints are you exploring to enable renewable energy projects? And if you can try and be brief, because I've literally got stacks of questions. I won't get to them all, but I'll do my level best to get to most of them. Jennie.
No problem, Andy. Yeah, and we've already touched upon the importance of the RESP in planning, in regional energy planning. And I think that process has been really welcomed by local areas in ensuring that their needs and their plans for growth are considered in that strategic planning. I think the challenge is the smaller scale planning and how that feeds into the RESP. So my experience is that the ability of local authorities, counties, regions to develop a local area energy plan and to do that real spatial planning on a smaller scale is really patchy across the UK. We've really struggled to access funding to develop a local area energy plan, and are mindful as we move towards devolution and forming a mayoral authority this year in Cumbria, that hopefully we can secure funding to do that crucial piece of work, because it seems like a really patchy process where different regions have quite a lot to learn from each other and from the early local area energy plans that have been produced, and how they are used dynamically to make decisions about investment locally, and to feed that into NESO and the rest. And in terms of innovations, we've already talked about sort of moving away from grid options, so looking at private wire or off-grid options to connect up local energy generation with offtake by current users or new energy intensive users locally. So yeah, some really interesting solutions that we're looking to pursue.
Thanks, Jenny. It's clear from what all of you said so far, and also many of the questions coming through, that there's some massive challenges here facing not just the grid, but how different organisations, different stakeholders basically interact with that as well, and address it. I mean, obviously, as we heard in our introductory session earlier this morning about the massive amount of infrastructure development that's going to take place, even just around one particular area of all of this, and then, if you like, plugging it into the grid. And I just want to turn to Adrian and ask him, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing the grid currently, but also to be even more optimistic, shall we say, where are the major opportunities as well, for the sector and for the industry as a whole?
Yeah. Let me start on the more positive one about things. I mean, Jenny started talking about this. I just wanted to build on this. It's one of the questions around, if you've got a congested grid, what can you do? So this idea of providing power on site, and there's different terms, microgrids, island power, I think you're going to see a lot more of that. So I just wanted to remind our audience there's different types. So you've got natural gas, may not be the most popular, but as a bridge to the low carbon economy, you can use natural gas to provide power to combined cycle gas turbines on site. And you're seeing a lot of that happening in the US, maybe less so here in the UK, but in Ireland, for example, that's something that's being considered. Obviously, local deployment of solar energy using battery energy storage is another big opportunity. And it's important to remember the UK is leading in terms of energy storage solutions. And then you've got technologies that have been around a long time and are beginning to gain momentum and beginning to scale up. So the likes of, Jenny mentioned, biogas is a really interesting one in terms of a feedstock with much lower emission footprint than natural gas. And geothermal, interestingly, it's been around for many, many, many decades. That's beginning to gather momentum here in the UK and also in other jurisdictions. We talk a lot about SMRs, small modular reactors. Just a kind of a context comment around that. There's a lot of talk about SMRs and this ability to, at some point in the future, to be able to put these reactors on site to provide significant power without having those issues around the grid connections that are plaguing other technologies. The thing to remember about SMRs is it's still not yet in practice. So these have yet to be deployed and standardized as a technology solution. There's a lot of talk in the media, but from what I understand, it's not until the early 2030s that we're likely to see scaled up deployment of them. But I would again mention, the UK is one of the leaders potentially in leading in the deployment of SMRs. So I think there's a good news story there. I want to stop there, Andy, because I want to keep the positive momentum going.
Okay, hopefully this next question won't spoil that positive momentum, but there's a question in the chat from Fatima Nayab, who says, and I'm going to address this in the first instance to James, with energy security and affordability sometimes pulling in opposite directions, what's the single hardest trade-off the UK will need to make before 2030? James.
I mean, I think, well, there's lots of trade-offs. He says, ducking the question skillfully. I mean, I think a question that is going to be a tough nut to crack in the price control is over what time period do we recover these costs from customers? If the customers in the next 5 years bear the burden, bear the cost of infrastructure that's effectively going to be used by customers over a 20, 30 or plus time period, is that fair? And is there a way we can, spread the cost impacts over future generations of customers, so it is more reflective of the benefits that are realized from the infrastructure? I think that politically might be necessary. Otherwise, you are loading a kind of equivalent to a tax burden on customers who aren't necessarily seeing the value for it. Why should your bills go up so that someone can buy an expensive electric vehicle if you're not in a position yourself to be able to to afford one? You can see how easily that narrative can be played back that could undermine I think the efforts of all of us, or the desires of all of us to support the transition. So getting some equity in terms of who pays, as well as making sure that no one is paying more than they should be, I think is going to be hard, because at the same time this investment won't happen if investors don't see the sector as being investable, and those investors aren't necessarily going to want to wait 30, 40 years before they get their money back from this sector. So that squaring that circle is going to require some considered and thoughtful work on our part and on the industry's part as to how we do this.
Yeah, I mean, go on, Adrian. I've got a supplementary to that, but hold that thought, James, as well. Adrian, go on. Just
a quick one, because that was an excellent question by the audience member, and a tricky one, right? So I'm going to manage expectations. I'm not going to answer it, but I just want to provide a little bit of the direction of travel, right? So I think if you think of the energy trilemma, which is all about sustainability, cost, and security of supply, we had a big focus on sustainability, kind of COP15 back about 5, 10, 15 years ago, that all the focus was on around a greener future. And if you remember COVID, we had COVID-19, we had that whole build back better kind of sentiment, right? Then we had the invasion of Ukraine, and that led to two things. Firstly, there was the cost of living crisis that triggered as we saw energy commodity prices kind of rocket through the roof, and the implications on inflation and cost of living for all of us, right? And then in this increasingly volatile geopolitical world that we're living in, energy security now has become even more important, right? And I think the reality is to James's point, trying to square that circle of those three different vectors is really difficult. The mood right now is very much energy security. And there may be an element of, well, energy security needs to come first ahead of cost, because if the lights go out, I think that's going to be a very big problem for many states. Having said that, there is this argument around relying on fossil fuels. Volatile fossil fuels is not a good place to be, which I totally recognize. But as we electrify and decarbonize, please don't forget that we are trading off one insecurity for another. So for all the talk of having domestic homegrown renewables, the reality is the materials that go into those technologies, a lot of them are rare earth minerals that are dominated by one key country. We haven't got a huge amount of diversity in our clean energy supply chain. And there are increasing concerns in some areas around cyber risk. As our energy systems more broadly, it's not just a grid thing, just generally, as our energy systems become much more integrated and interconnected, there's a concern of cybersecurity being a risk. And I think that's another kind of insecurity that we just need to be aware of. So it's complex.
Thanks, Adrian, for pointing that out. I mean, it is complex, but I think, and I'm sure James would agree with this because he deals with it every day, cost is an issue and will be an issue. And I was struck by the comments that were made yesterday in the announcement in relation to the auction for offshore wind, because everyone who commented on that successful announcement yesterday said that it would lead to electricity bills going down. And I think, you know, whether that, I mean, it's not even an elephant in the room. I think that just has to happen. You know, otherwise public support for all of this, frankly, will be in jeopardy. And if I'm, you know, I'm not, but if I was a disinterested observer and looking at the subsidies being bandied around to, you know, mega energy companies, bidders for these contracts and all the rest of it, government money going in, so that those companies can, you know, yes, they've got to turn a profit, otherwise they won't invest. But at the same time, if we're then turning around and saying, well, actually, you know, people are going to have to keep paying higher bills in order that future generations can reap the benefits of cheaper energy, I'm not sure how politically acceptable that would be going forward. Sorry to bring the P word into it, but at the end of the day, I don't think you can ignore that. And I think that whole issue will potentially become even more of a question as we get closer and closer, you know, to a different phase in the electoral cycle. I won't put it any more definite than that. And I just want to ask this question as well that's been posed by Melanie Manton, because it's kind of linked to that to a certain extent, and maybe James can address it first of all. Do current regulatory frameworks adequately support grid modernisation for renewable integration, or do we need a fundamental shift? What's your view on that?
I mean, I think the current regulatory arrangements are sufficiently adaptable to be able to, you know, support grid modernisation. That's what we're aiming to do in ED3. That's what we were we believe we have done through the RIIO-free price control for the electricity and transmission networks. There are elements outside of our immediate gift that would undoubtedly help. We don't control the planning system. You know, that you know, we can support companies in helping them overcome skills and supply chain constraints, but again, it's kind of outside of our remit. And ultimately, although we are, you know, working with government on a review of the connections queue and how that sort of removes some ghost projects from the queue, so that you know, those that are ready to be connected can be connected, not being held up unnecessarily. We generally do take a kind of non-discriminatory approach to who gets connected. We don't pick winners. We don't decide that some type of customer is more virtuous than another type of customer so that they should get first dibs on capacity as it becomes available. Now, people, you know, may argue that we should, but I question whether actually you want an economic regulator to be choosing winners in that context. If that, you know, it may be a better question for, you know, someone with an elected mandate rather than a civil servant. But in any event, it would require legislative change for us to be able to do that. So I think within the within our duties, within the boundaries that legislation has provided us, I think we do have regulatory frameworks that can support grid modernisation. And if there are elements of them that need to adapt, we adapt them. You know, and undoubtedly through the ED3 process, we'll spot opportunities to, you know, modify our approach and introduce new elements because we think it will lead to better outcomes.
Okay, thanks, James. We are running out of time, and I'm going to ask probably what's an unfair question to all of our panelists now as we finish, and ask them to be very brief in answering it. The title of this session was about upgrading for a net zero Britain and how do we modernise and expand those networks to meet that challenge. If you, you know, were in charge of all of this and could make it happen, what would be the one area that you would say we really need to get to grips with X? What would that be? And I'm going to start with Adrian.
I'm going to keep it short and sweet. I would focus on innovation in terms of the technology we use, innovation in terms of the processes around how we deliver these projects, innovation about the ways we work together to deliver this massive grid infrastructure upgrade.
Thanks, Adrian. James?
I would try to find a language that goes beyond the energy bill and starts to articulate the societal and economic benefits that are associated with this work. I think there is a danger that we become quite myopic and say, well, you know, we build networks, it has this impact on the energy bill, and that's the topic everyone focuses on, as opposed to the broader range of benefits that we can all enjoy in that the investment is enabling. I think if we can do that, then I think that can go a long way to providing the buy-in that we need from society for this.
Okay, thanks, James. And finally, Jennie, briefly, if you can.
Yes, so for me, it's looking beyond the grid. So innovative solutions that mitigate grid constraints for industries where electrification is not possible, or to ease those constraints on the grid.
Thanks very much, Jennie, and thanks to Adrian, thanks to James and all of our panelists in this session. There's so much more we could have discussed here, and I'm sure it'll be an ongoing discussion, because the challenge is massive when you look into this area. I mean, we didn't touch on the whole skills question, for example, which I know is a massive challenge in all of this, and a massive opportunity as well, and I'm sure we'll touch on that in some of our other discussions this morning. But for now, I'd just like again to thank Jennie Stein, Adrian Del Maestro and James Veaney for being fantastic panelists and for enabling a great discussion, and also our audience for some very searching questions, not all of which we'll be able to get to, but rest assured we will try and address some of those later on this morning, and if not, we'll do some stuff online or on them as well, because there's some really thoughtful questions. We're just going to have a brief break now, and then we're going to come back to our next session, which is on powering Britain's future, securing clean, reliable and affordable energy. So a 10-minute break, and then we'll see you bang on 10 o'clock. Thanks very much to our panelists.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.